So I want to begin, of course, by thanking the Society and all of you here today for the invitation that has brought me here. In particular, thanking David Shaps for extending the invitation on the Society's behalf. Thanking Lisa Morris and Rachel Zelnick-Abramovitz for more recently helping me so graciously and so generously. It's been an absolute pleasure for both me and my wife. And having this chance to be with you, I've decided to use the opportunity to turn over a new leaf. Or perhaps more accurately, to begin to backtrack from a detour that my work took starting about 10 years ago. At the time, after finishing my commentary on Cicero's defense of Publius Cestius, I thought that I had identified in the speech's trafficking in praise a subject that could be treated more generally: the use of praise in late Roman Republican culture. After all, invective, the dark and snarling twin of praise, had long received a fair amount of attention, so I thought, why not give praise a chance? Of course, that did mean that I would have to begin by confronting the most conspicuous manifestation of late Roman Republican praise, namely the praise that Cicero lavishes on himself. Cicero's apparent conceit, and why I say apparent will become clear, Cicero's apparent conceit is not a very pretty sight to most modern eyes. And those who have had the chance to steel themselves to gaze upon it soon discovered the classic study published 65 years ago by Walter Allen under the title precisely Cicero's Conceit. There, Allen gathered much of the evidence of the phenomenon and made it, if not wildly attractive, at least culturally intelligible. It's certainly not my aim today to take issue seriously with Allen's treatment, but I do want to suggest that there's something perhaps more to say about Cicero's self-praise, and especially about his use of praise more generally, which was not part of Allen's topic. So to focus my argument, I use the Procestio, the most elaborate and most interesting of the so-called post-veritum speeches, the speeches delivered in the 6 months or so after Cicero returned from exile, where he takes the opportunity both to look back in time, to give his version of Roman politics leading to his exile in 58 and 57, and to survey the current political scene in a long excursus on the so-called populares and optimates. The speech's scope makes it useful because it is a virtual laboratory of Ciceronian invective and praise. In it, Cicero elaborately and memorably caricatures the major villains, his great enemy Publius Clodius Pulcher, who drove him into exile, the consuls of 58, Piso and Gabinius, who collaborated, and he abuses at greater or lesser length a handful of other knaves along the way. More important for my purpose today, he bestows praise on over 24 contemporaries in remarks that range from brief honorific notices to full-blown encomia. It is also a speech in which his self-aggrandizement seems to reach heights it had not scaled before and would certainly never reach again. So to start, I'll quickly summarize the main lines of Walter Allen's essay for orientation, and then fill out the picture a bit by considering the way Cicero's self-aggrandizement works in Procestio. In the second half of my discussion, I'll show how Cicero's self-aggrandizement in this speech is inseparable from the praise of others, in the two senses of that phrase, both the praise that Cicero bestows on others, and no less important, the praise that others bestow on him. Among the important points that Allen makes, I can briefly recapitulate the four that are particularly relevant to my own argument. First, though Roman elite culture nurtured among its members a degree of vanity that is both frankly expressed and quite breathtaking by modern middle-class standards, even modern academic standards, the same culture placed limits on the amount of self-praise that could be tolerated. Second, there is no evidence that contemporaries generally regarded Cicero as conspicuously exceeding those limits. No evidence that any but his enemies found much occasion to criticize his self-praise. No evidence, where his forensic speeches are concerned, that his self-praise was counterproductive, for example, in alienating juries. And no reason to suppose that he would have persisted in the practice had it been counterproductive. Third, and despite appearances to the contrary, Cicero repeatedly shows himself to be sensitive to the question how far self-praise was socially acceptable. Finally, when he finds himself in circumstances where self-praise seems needed, he typically frames the necessity in terms of maintaining his dignitas. That is, he must speak in ways that are honorific to himself because he is compelled to respond to wrongs, to injuriae that have detracted from his dignitas, or because the worth of deeds that have gained him praise has been brought under doubt. Here, the tension inherent in self-praise is helpful in illuminating the hierarchy of values within the culture, as the imperative of maintaining your dignitas trumps the imperative of moderating the way you talk about yourself. And when you reflect that Cicero merely praises himself to maintain his dignitas, whereas Julius Caesar invaded Italy, you can put things in perspective. I believe that Allen got all of this essentially and very helpfully right. Yet if we turn to Procestio, we find there is a dimension of Cicero's conceit on which his discussion does not really touch. It's an important dimension, and one not limited to this speech. To appreciate it, we must first consider the speech's setting and argument. So bear with me as I go over the background. On February 10 of the year 56, a charge of vis, public violence, was brought against Publius Cestius, who as tribune the previous year, in 57, had supported Cicero's recall from exile. Indeed, it is Cestius, along with his fellow tribune Titus Annius Milo, and the consul Publius Lentulus Spinther, whom Cicero repeatedly credits with being chiefly responsible for his recall. Hence the sense of obligation that he expresses at the start of the speech when he says, quote, "I once thought that I would be obliged to use my voice in thanking those who have most earned my gratitude, but I am now forced to use it in warding off the perils launched against them." In Cestius's case, it was an obligation Cicero was able to fulfill independent of his own sentiments. For his correspondence shows that he was at the time rather put out with the person he found a rather peevish fellow, morosus homo. But of course, none of that shows on the surface of the speech, that he delivered roughly 1 month after the charge was first brought, late in the second week of March. Speaking last, as was his custom, after speeches by Gaius Licinius Calvus, Marcus Licinius Crassus, and Quintus Hortensius, Cicero felt free to range rather widely, delivering what he called in the exordium an unmethodical and general defense, confusa atque universa defensio. And indeed, it is extraordinarily difficult to infer from this speech exactly what specific acts the charge against Cestius comprised. Though Cicero spends 6,600 words describing the events of 58, up to and following his departure into exile, another 2,100 words on the events of 57, when Cestius was tribune, he uses exactly 125 words to describe a single act of Cestius as tribune. And that happens to concern an episode in which Cestius himself was the object of a violent attack. To the extent that this strategy resulted in a certain obfuscation, that was no doubt a welcome side effect. but it was surely only a side effect, for the main strategy that Cicero chose to follow was far bolder. Any charge of vis was a political charge, not just in the sense that it was often brought by one political faction against a member of another, as was certainly true in Cestius's case, but in the more fundamental sense that it alleged a political crime, a crime against the interests of the community as a whole. Any charge of vis alleged that the relevant acts were not only criminally wrong, but were fundamentally contra rem publicum, against the common good. Consequently, the charge invited a political defense, which is exactly what Cicero mounts, with a stunning simplicity and directness. He contends that the events leading to his exile amounted to an overthrow of the res publica, and that the events leading to his recall amounted to the Republic's restoration. That is why he spends so many thousands of words on the events of 58, and why he really does not need to address any of Cestius's specific acts. If the attacks upon himself undermined the Commonwealth, if his expulsion laid the Commonwealth low, if his restoration revived it, then by definition, no action on Cestius's part to secure his return could be against the public interest. That the Commonwealth's interests differed in no important way from his own is a central thought that Cicero uses to undermine the prosecution's case. Hence his attempt to identify himself with the res publica and vice versa, an attempt that begins at the speech's outset and never lets up. And I've put a few examples on handout number 1. From section 5, Fortune herself established that Publius Cestius should hold the tribunate in the civil community's gravest crisis, when the Commonwealth, overturned and battered, lay in ruins. That is, when Cicero himself was in exile. Section 15, I must set out in detail the shipwreck that the Commonwealth suffered in the previous year, that is to say 58, the year of Cicero's exile, for you will find that everything Cestius later said, did, and intended was aimed at picking up the pieces and restoring the well-being of us all. Section 24, the consuls in 58 openly made a pact with Clodius that they could have their pick of the provinces, provided that they first handed over the Commonwealth, battered and bound, to the tribune. Moreover, they said that the deal, once struck, could be sealed with my blood. And so on and on and on. But wait now, you might say, what sort of argument is this? The exile of one man was equivalent to the Republic's overthrow? The restoration of that one man was the equivalent of the Republic's resurrection? Surely there could be no more striking example of self-aggrandizement, of egomania raised pathologically to the level of political principle. Well, yes, that's how it appears at first sight. Yet there are a few significant points to note about this argument, however bizarre it might seem. First, and on a practical level, it apparently worked, or at a minimum, did not hurt, for Cestius was acquitted unanimously by the jury of 75 men. Second, much more important, the argument is not quite what it appears to be at first sight. Consider the passages that appear on item 2 in the handout. First, from section 27, what greater distinction could anyone find in all history than this, that all patriots, on their own and in concert, and the entire Senate, as a matter of public policy, took on the dress of mourning for one of their fellow citizens? Or section 50, any risk to my life placed the Commonwealth in peril, and I was for that reason commended to the protection of foreign peoples by letters sent by the consuls in accord with the Senate's resolution. Section 121, I, whom Quintus Catulus and many others in the Senate had called Father of the Fatherland. Section 128, for did the Senate ever commend any citizen save me to the protection of foreign nations, ever express formal thanks for any citizen's well-being save mine. In my case alone, did the conscript fathers decree that provincial governors should safeguard my life and well-being. In my case alone did the consuls send letters to call together all who desired the Commonwealth's safety. Said his letters to the towns of Italy. What the Senate never decreed when the Commonwealth as a whole faced danger, it thought it must decree to preserve my well-being alone. Finally, section 129, that hero, namely Pompey, bore witness in a prepared statement of his views to the fact that I alone had saved the fatherland. A packed meeting of the Senate so fully aligned itself with his statement that only a single enemy of the people dissented, namely Clodius, of course, and that very fact was entrusted to the public records so that generations to come would ever remember it. The Senate decreed that no one was to bring to bear any cause for delay in securing my return, and that if anyone did otherwise, he would patently be seeking to overturn the Commonwealth. Now, there are several points to be made about these passages. First, they show that Cicero's premise in the speech, identifying himself and his interests with the res publica and the public interest, did not involve self-aggrandizement at all, if by that term is meant inflating one's worth beyond some generally recognized assessment. The generally recognized assessment was exactly that his well-being was identical with the Commonwealth's. Nor did his premise involve boasting, if that means engaging in self-praise and making claims about one's own abilities or status. Cicero was neither praising himself nor making claims of his own. He was reporting what others had said of him in praise, for the most part as matters of the formal public record, something that I believe is generally true when he makes such statements about himself. And what others had said of him in praise quite precisely identified him and his interests with the res publica and the public interest, thereby providing him with the basis for his defense. Second, everything that he reports, as far as we know, is true, as a matter of fact. We know that the Senate's decrees were stored in the aerarium, where they could be reviewed, referred to, and checked by generations to come, as Cicero says. We know that the Senate and people had previously assumed mourning dress to mark some public catastrophe, and we know that they would do so in the future. But it appears that they had in fact never done so in response to an individual's misfortune. And by doing so, they indeed signaled that the individual's misfortune was tantamount to a public catastrophe. It was probably for this very reason that the hostile councils of 58 ordered the Senate to resume normal dress, an act for which Cicero could never forgive them. In fact, Cicero seems rather scrupulous in reporting all this testimony. Notice that whereas he is unsurprisingly keen to notice gestures made by senatorial decree and to record honors uniquely bestowed upon him, he only says that Quintus Catulus and many others in the Senate applied the honorific phrase pater patriae to him. That is, after the suppression of the Catilinarians. He does not say that it was decreed or that he was the first to be so called. And we happen to know that the title was not bestowed by senatorial decree until the Senate gave it to Caesar after the Battle of Munda, over a decade later. And we also know that Cicero himself, for one, had previously applied the honorific phrase pater patriae to Marius when he was defending Gaius Rabirius earlier in 63. Very well, you might say. So he's not making it all up and thumping his chest to inflate his worth. But really, must he? I mean, isn't it all rather unbecoming? Of course, I'm not suggesting that Cicero found it burdensome or distasteful to identify himself with the res publica. But in a word, no, it was not unbecoming. Indeed, quite the opposite. Not to have deployed this testimony, as he does, would have been ethically strange for two very Roman reasons. First, as he says at the outset of the speech, he was, quote, obliged to use his voice, not only in thanking those who had most earned his gratitude, but also in warding off the perils launched against them. Satisfying such obligations stood very near the top of the Roman hierarchy of moral needs. To have had at hand the means to do the job in a way that could extinguish the danger at its source by overturning its premise, and then refuse to use those means, well, at very best, that would seem to engage in overly nice concerns about oneself, when concerns about oneself were not the main item on the agenda. But, and this is the second reason, there is no ground for supposing that Cicero did have cause to be concerned about himself in any case. The acts of praise that he recorded, the quasi-ritual gestures of public mourning, the Senate's decrees, the consul's letters, and so on, were very simply the just reward of the patriot. It was, to use language Cicero himself uses in Procestio, the bona fama bonorum, the good opinion that good men spread abroad about one. Quae sola vere gloria nominare potest, the only thing that can really be called glory. In the system of Roman values, a system that, where glory was concerned, Cicero did not question until the very end of his life, this was the only compensation a good citizen decently sought for his service to the community. Such a citizen would, of course, continue to render that service even if the compensation were not forthcoming, but once glory was gained, not to be glad of it, not to encourage others to share your gladness by spreading it abroad, that would be quite un-Roman. By speaking of that praise, Cicero was just wearing the public character that he was entitled to wear, assembled from all the things that good men said about him. Now, it is true that the good men in question could not have intended their praise to be used quite for the purpose that Cicero uses it here, to defend a man who surely was guilty, if not of public violence according to the letter of the law, then certainly of contributing to the general level of political violence in the last decade of the Republic, a point that Cicero himself in effect concedes. It is no less certainly true that the praise of others reported here could not have been the transparent, unanimous, and spontaneous thing that Cicero represents it as being. For example, he neglects to mention that when the people and the Senate adopted mourning in his support, they were actually following his own lead. For he had assumed mourning dress after Clodius promulgated his first law aimed against Cicero, a move that Cicero himself later came to regard as a gross tactical error, as his correspondence from exile reveals. And surely whatever was going through Pompey's mind on that day in July 57, when he read from a prepared statement to declare Cicero the Commonwealth's unique savior, it cannot have been simple. For one thing, when something like that very claim was communicated to Pompey by Cicero himself early in 62, it had put a lasting frost on their relations. Pompey wanted to hear nothing about that. For another, Pompey himself was the man who had most flagrantly betrayed Cicero during his crisis in 58. But such considerations do not matter much in the Roman economy of praise. In this economy, praise is a commodity, a thing of value traded back and forth. Any given act of praise is like a piece of currency put into circulation. It becomes transferable, like the cash I might pay you for services rendered, and the recipient is free to use it to suit his needs. Within this economy of praise, a stereotypical view of Cicero would suppose that he was above all a consumer, avidly accumulating and parting with little. but that is not at all the case. As I've already noted, his defense of Cestius teems with praise bestowed on others besides himself and the defendant. To illustrate the variousness of this praise and some of the workings of the economy of praise I just remarked, I want to turn in the balance of my time to consider Cicero, the producer of praise, and to the praise he bestows on others. I have summarized these occasions of praise on the handout, number 3, the second side, arranging them from the simplest and most obvious types and uses to those that are more complex and interesting, both rhetorically and socially. And my survey will proceed in the same order. Simplest and most numerous, and surely most familiar, are the brief and highly formalized appositive phrases, such as we find in the notice of Quintus Hortensius, quote, a most distinguished and eloquent gentleman, where an epithet denoting social prestige, clarissimus, honestissimus, egregius, is typically joined with another epithet denoting a specific valued trait, like eloquence. These are the expected cliches of praise, much like the cliches of abuse that animate invective and that allow us to predict that the target of abuse will be declared a base-born wastrel and coward who spent a dissolute youth as a prostitute before becoming a bankrupt cutpurse. But before we dismiss them as mere cliches, let's pause a minute to consider some of the real work that cliches accomplish. We can notice first that though the number of people praised is not small, the range of qualities for which they are praised is quite narrow. Except for the Lainii, members of a provincial family of Brundisium who sheltered Cicero on his flight into exile and who are praised as docti, the qualities cluster very densely around fortitudo and fides, and related excellences on the order of constantia, gravitas, and magnitudo animi, along with virtus in the very strongly gendered sense of manliness. They are the core virtues of Roman public life, the virtues of the boni, the good men who uphold the common good, the patriots. They are predictable and stereotypical, and they are useful in praise and valued in practice precisely because they are predictable and stereotypical. Just because they are unsurprising and not idiosyncratic, they can be shared to a superlative degree by any number of men. And those men can uphold the common good just because they share them. To put the point another way, we would never expect to hear Pompey praised as, quote, the most agile mind of his generation. Not just because mental agility was not conspicuous among his noteworthy traits, but because the Romans did not especially value mental agility as a political virtue, and because the form of expression, the most X of his generation, is too distinctive, too individualizing. It is the great merit of the Latin superlative for this purpose that it is non-exclusive. Only one man can be called the most agile mind of his generation, but any number of men can be fortissimi. In this respect, the praise bestowed on Cicero, for example, as the unique savior of the Commonwealth, appears all the more extraordinary. The praise that Cicero bestows in these phrases distinguishes the recipient, but only by placing him in a category of men who are distinguished to an equally superlative degree in respect of bravery, loyalty, and the like. The categories taken altogether define the boni, the real patriots. Of course, it is a favorite stance of Cicero, especially in the speeches after his exile, that all good men stand together on the same side, which is to say, on his side, united against an outcast band of renegades and desperados. Accordingly, just because they identify the qualities of the boni, these brief courtesy notices serve at the same time as markers denoting the people who, at least for the present occasion, can be regarded as mei, as my people, the people on my side. Here the phrases serve two main purposes. First, and most straightforwardly, they are a form of currency used to underwrite a system of retributive justice, of payback. In other words, I make they denote the return that I make to those who have helped me, just as invective is the return I make to those who have harmed me. One example of this payback is the praise of the Lainii, the family of Brindisium already mentioned, whose cultivation receives notice. Another example is the praise twice bestowed on the relatively obscure figure Lucius Ninius, who as tribune in 58 had done what he could to support Cicero in the prelude to his exile. More subtly, the phrases of praise are a means of maintaining a certain public face when referring to persons with whom one's relations might be problematic. Hortensius, that most distinguished and eloquent gentleman, was in fact one of the aristocrats who Cicero believed had acted out of spite and envy to betray him at his moment of crisis, to let him down during his exile, and to obstruct him even after his return. Only after Hortensius supported Cicero for election to the College of Augurs, 3 years after this speech, could Cicero speak of him with genuine warmth. But of course, this was not the occasion to let any of those resentments show, when Hortensius was part of the team defending Cestius. Even more problematic were Cicero's relations with Pompey and Crassus, both of whom were present at the trial. Crassus as another advocate for the defense, Pompey as a character witness for Cestius. Conflicted does not begin to describe Cicero's attitude toward Pompey, who had ruthlessly failed him in 58. As for Crassus, just a few weeks before this speech, Cicero had learned from Pompey that the magnate was funding the arch-villain Clodius in his ongoing villainies. But of course, both received the expected tokens of courtesy. Still, the case of Pompey and Crassus provides a reminder that even the merest cliches of courtesy can have real force, if not through their presence, then through their omission. In the one passage where Cicero cannot avoid referring to the three dynasts, Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar, all together, he does so in these terms. This is handout number 4. Gnaeus Pompeius, a most distinguished man and most friendly disposed to me now, as he was to the extent possible then, in 58. Marcus Crassus, the bravest of men, with whom I enjoyed every degree of friendship. And Gaius Caesar, whom I had never given just cause to be estranged from me. The omission of even a specious superlative makes the reference to Caesar, who was not present, every bit as chilly as the March day on which the speech was delivered. That chill is made only more biting in the one apparently laudatory phrase that Cicero applies to Caesar in the speech. This is handout number 5. When he refers to him as, quote, a gentle person to whom bloodshed is alien. Given that Caesar for 2 years had been slaughtering Gaul by the 10,000s, we might suspect irony. But Cicero is no doubt thinking only of Roman blood, and the irony lies elsewhere. Cicero alludes to Caesar's position opposing the execution of the Catilinarians in December of 63. It was, of course, those executions that armed Clodius in his attack on Cicero, and Caesar had restated his opposition to those executions in a public meeting called by Clodius just days before Cicero fled in March of 58. A fact that Cicero suppresses in this speech, though he surely did not forget it. I'll round off this survey by looking briefly at 2 other passages where Cicero uses praise for more substantial argumentative purposes than merely positioning himself vis-a-vis another person in passing. The first occurs early in the speech when Cicero is providing the obligatory sketch of the defendant's early life to show that the virtues Cestius displayed as tribune had deep roots. He wishes to show in particular that the devotion Cestius displayed in supporting Cicero himself is of a piece with the admirable devotion Cestius earlier displayed to several authoritative older men, his own father and the fathers of his first and second wives. He must therefore bring the older men on stage, which he does in these terms. This is item number 6 on the handout. Publius Cestius's father, judges, was, as most of you recall, a wise, pure, and strict man who came in first in the elections for tribune of the plebs in a field that included some of the most notable men at a very favorable time for our community, that is the 90s BCE, but was thereafter less keen to enjoy further office than to be seen worthy of it. Gaius Albanius, the most honorable and respected man, a most honorable and respected man. That most excellent and unfortunate man, Lucius Scipio, who had been cast out when the Commonwealth was tossed on turbulent seas. A man then prostrate in a foreign land, who could rightly have followed in the footsteps of his ancestors. If Cicero seems to be working especially hard in the first and last cases, that is because he is, with good reason. The excellent and unfortunate Lucius Scipio was Lucius Cornelius Scipio Asiagonus, an adherent of Marius who became consul in 83 and was a thoroughly despicable piece of work even by the terrible standards of the 80s. Deeply treacherous, twice deserted by his army, he fled to Marseille either just before or just after being proscribed, though of course Cicero's euphemisms and cliches disclose none of this. As for the elder Cestius, he is introduced in terms that make him a paragon even among defendants' fathers, who are generally made to seem candidates for beatitude. Whereas strict Severus is what any father should be, the only individuals Cicero elsewhere describes as both wise, sapiens, and morally pure, sanctus, are the optimate leader, Quintus Catullus, and Socrates. When Cicero assures the majority of the judges that they recall the good man's election to a tribunate sometime in the halcyon days of the 90s, he is merely planting a useful idea in their minds, since most of them almost certainly were too young to recall it in fact. When he says that the elder Cestius was thereafter less keen to enjoy further office than to be seen worthy of it, he means that the man either withdrew from service to the Commonwealth or was defeated when he stood for further office. Were he an opponent, Cicero would of course attack him for the former trait or demean him for the latter. In these sketches, Cicero toils to spin hay into gold, using praise for rhetorically conventional ends in ways that are, unsurprisingly, economical with the truth. My last example involves a passage that is much more ambitious and revealing in several ways. The praise of the, quote, godlike Milo and the immortal manliness displayed while he was tribune in 57, one of the two full-fledged encomia that Cicero incorporates in the speech. The other encomium of the younger Cato would be just as interesting to examine if time permitted. The passage occurs at the climax of what passes for Cicero's formal defense, just before he turns from his narrative of past events to consider present circumstances in the excursus on the optimates and populares that engrosses the last third of the speech. Cicero's premise for the encomium, briefly, is this. In January of 57, a terrible riot had bloodied the Forum when Clodius's thugs violently disrupted a voting assembly that was aimed at achieving Cicero's recall. And in the days and weeks that followed, the same thugs ran amok in the city. When, in the course of their frenzy, they attacked Milo's house, Milo had shown proper restraint, at first seeking only to bring a charge of public violence against Clodius for attacking the home of a magistrate. And it was only after he was blocked from bringing the charge, when, as Cicero puts it, the courts were uprooted, judicia sublata, that Milo assembled an armed force of his own to meet force with force for the sake of the common good. All as Cicero puts it. In doing so, as Cicero says, Milo demonstrated that, quote, it is ever right to resist by law and legal procedure the crimes of reckless men, but if the laws are impotent, then life and liberty must of necessity be defended with the bulwark of force. There are 2 points to be made about this encomium. First, it is the single most deceptive passage in the speech. Not a small claim in itself. Second, it is useful to Cicero in 2 quite different ways. As commonly in Cicero's speeches, the deception lies not so much in what he says as what he fails to say. It does indeed appear that Milo was prevented from bringing a charge against Clodius. But the immediate cause of that frustration was almost certainly an act taken by Cicero's own allies in the Senate, who had declared a justitium, a cessation of legal process and all other public business, as a kind of general strike to protest the riot in January. A move to which Cicero happened to refer in the parallel narrative he gave when thanking the Senate immediately after his return in September 57, but which he completely suppresses here. The suppression allows him to present Milo not as the headstrong and impulsive character we otherwise have reason to think he was, but as a model of sober constitutionality. And having created that character for Milo, he is able to make it serve double duty. First and more directly, it is useful for the defense of Cestius. It allows him to cast Cestius in the same mold as Milo and to argue that he too had assembled a praesidium of his own, that is to say, a crew of thugs and gladiators, only unwillingly, under compulsion, and for the sake of self-defense. The second purpose this tricky encomium serves becomes plain when we recall 2 facts about Milo. As tribune in 57, he too had labored for Cicero's recall and was therefore among those to whom Cicero owed a great deal. Second, Milo was currently in peril himself, because Clodius had, in early February, brought Milo to trial before the people on a charge of violence. And at the time of the speech in defense of Cestius, Milo's trial was in adjournment, the charge still hanging over Milo's head. In other words, by offering this encomium, Cicero is working to repay his debt to Milo not just by offering the currency of generalized praise, but by laying out a specific plea in his defense. In fact, we know that Cicero had done just this sort of thing, speaking in one trial with his eye on another very recently. The last item on the handout, number 7. On February 11th, the day after Cestius was charged, Cicero appeared in defense of Calpurnius Bestia. And as he tells his brother in a letter, he took the occasion to lay the grounds of his future defense, inserting in his speech for Bestia an extended eulogy of Cestius, just as he inserts in the present speech for Cestius an extended eulogy for Milo. It pleases me to imagine that on this occasion, Pompey, one of Milo's advocates, seated there in court while Cicero spoke, was taking notes. Now, I hope I have persuaded you that the practice of praise we find in Cicero is at least as interesting as the practice of invective, and if anything, more diverse. On the one hand, one could publicly praise others for any number of reasons, as we see Cicero doing in the eulogies he doles out in Procestio. On the other, the person eulogized was free to turn the praise he received to any number of uses, as we also see Cicero doing in the passages commonly regarded as self-aggrandizing. To use again the economic metaphor of exchange, praise was a form of currency, and no token of praise served only one determinate purpose, forever and immutably. If we had a larger view than Cicero himself affords, if we had more of the orations, more of the correspondence of his contemporaries, we could surely trace a vast economy of praise at work, in which little of the praise is quite what it seems, and even less of it seems to be just one thing. As the tokens are traded back and forth, repaying a creditor here, underwriting an expansion of one's own dignitas there. But even with the limitations of the material we have in Cicero, there is, I think, ample scope for further work. Thank you for listening. Happy to take questions.
I think it was a wonderful speech.
Thank you.
I think it was fine.
It's the most.
Did you ever give some thought to comparing this economy of rhetoric or praise in Roman antiquity with modern politics and politics? And if so, how do you compare?
Okay, yes. The question is, have I ever thought about expanding my scope of vision to compare the ancient use of praise, especially in political discourse, with the contemporary use? The short answer is yes. Slightly longer answer is contained in a sentence that I, and quite unintentionally included in my text, where I say that Cicero contends that the events leading to his exile amounted to the overthrow of the, wrong order. Right. Here, the tensions inherent in self-praise are helpful in illuminating hierarchy of values within the culture, as the imperative of maintaining your dignitas trumps the imperative of moderating the way you talk about yourself. I mean, yes, you could go on ad lib from there. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
I also wanted to ask something about comparison, but within Cicero. There are a lot of cases of Cicero praising and creating sort of group of audience, also in his philosophical work.
Yeah.
Especially in the Author and Brutus, they actually create a dynasty of those good men.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, since he isn't actually speaking to a live audience,
Mm-hmm.
and he has also sort of motive, what is the relationship you might see between those two kinds of texts?
I don't think fundamentally there's an important difference in the sense that they were both kinds of texts. The forensic speeches and the philosophical texts were essentially aimed at the same audience, the audience of the elite. I mean, the speech in praise in defense of Cestius was aimed at a jury in the first instance composed of senators, equites, and the tribuni aerarii, and at the level, census level below the equites, basically all members of the elite. And the people that he was addressing in his philosophical works were surely at least the more literate members of those same three groups. And I think anyone who grew up in the culture as Cicero did, and remember Cicero was basically an outsider who took on the mores and the coloring of the elite, would have understood the uses of praise in exactly the same way, and consciously or unconsciously would have recognized the uses to which the praise was being put. Jonathan, yeah.
Where was this speech given?
Where?
Yeah.
In the forum.
Well, if that's the case, then there were the judges, but also
Right.
the crowd who were not
right,
part of the elite. And
right.
that's what strikes me. I thought this was the Roman population, so
Yeah.
they were also cued into this coding. They'd be spectators of this exchange. It's sort of they were watching this exchange happening like on the the stock exchange happening.
Yeah.
Well, these people who actually had the currency and the value,
Mhm.
but they weren't. In other words, I guess another support for your argument that this was accepted and understood is that they weren't interrupting. At least I assume.
Not apparently. Yeah.
It's saying arrogant,
Yeah.
pompous, whatever, right?
Yeah.
They were spectators to this exchange of currency between the elite as well.
Yeah. And I again, I believe that a member of the Corona around watching Cicero's speech
Right.
would be disappointed if if someone in Cicero's position did not use the prestige he had to the maximum, the tools he had to the maximum, because that would have been their notion of what a Roman senator, member of the Roman elite, was supposed to do. And not along exactly the same lines, but along related lines, Cicero was especially eager for Atticus to get the Procestio into circulation after its delivery. And so we have a letter from Cicero to Atticus urging him to get it out there because it would be sure to benefit the Juventus, the youth, and who would find it an edifying document. David.
In Parliament, members never address each other by name. You were always the honourable member for Mudpuddle or whatever. You are, and if you have ever served in the army, you are the honourable and gallant member
Okay.
for Mudpuddle. And there's a case where one person referred to Randolph Churchill, who was at that time member of Parliament, as the honourable and gallant member for Scotland. I mentioned this, I call him this because he at one time held some position somewhere and then went on and on. Whereupon, when they met outside of that, Churchill himself absolutely blew up at him and refused to, said, "I won't talk to you at all. You called my son a coward in front of everybody." And this was, in short, these apparently honorable words were very, very clearly recognized. Now, the Cicero speech is not like that. Because they're not. Well, again, in courts, the opposing lawyers always refer to each other as my learned colleague.
Right.
My learned colleague seems never to have opened a book. Cicero is not at all using fixed phrase, but to what extent? Now, I guess my question is, it's another question. To what extent? At what point does it become? At what point is there irony being used? At what point is he damning with faint praise, or alternatively praising, damning by overpraising somebody that everybody everybody will recognize?
Damning, I suspect that damning by overpraise would have been harder to recognize than damning with faint praise. And in fact, what he says about Pompey, most noble, so forth and so on, who was even at that time favorably disposed to me as he was able to be. That cuts both ways in unmistakable in unmistakable terms. And I'm sure that if Caesar himself were not off in Gaul, but were there in the Forum in March of 56, Cicero would have spoken of him in quite a different way than he did, with obvious irony. A man to whom bloodshed, to whose conscience bloodshed is repugnant, or something along those terms. So it really depended on who was there, who would get what he said. In the case of Pompey, I think not a few people would have got what he said. In the case of
There's a famous case of you are our Magnus in Fort where they kept demanding the actors would repeat that over and over.
Yes, right.
Everybody got it.
And I'm sure everybody would have would have understood the purpose of the way he talks about Caesar also. You're referring to the protocols of the British Parliament, remind me also of the protocols of the U.S. Senate, in which a senator from Illinois named Everett Dirksen, this goes back some 40, 50 years, was known for his courtesy and his cleverness and for observing the protocol by which determined that one never referred to a fellow senator by name, but rather by the distinguished senator from so-and-so. So on one occasion he referred to the distinguished senator from so-and-so, whom I hold in minimally high regard. A phrase I have always cherished and on occasion used.
Prof, the Speaker of the House, who, when one of the members was in 1890, he was using an old phrase, said he would rather be right than president. And Prof answered, the honourable member may feel calm, he will never be either. Another question is, to what extent is your praise dependent on what you have to say because of who their friends are? An awful lot of Republican politicians nowadays are lavishing praise on a person who they speak about very differently behind his back.
Of course, yeah. And I believe that was no different in 56 BCE than it is today.
He said in the letter, he says it's called Morosos.
Yeah, what a pain in the neck this guy is. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think there are maybe chances of instances of people with whom Cicero was in enmity in time of the speech, but later on grew warm or at least less the enmity was lessened. So do you think it might just be that Cicero inserted certain words or phrases afterwards into the speeches? It's not a recorded protocol.
No, it's not recorded, and probably wasn't even written down before Cicero delivered it. But the speed with which he made sure that it became circulated leads me to think that at least on this occasion, the difference between how he spoke about people in the oral version and how that's reflected in the written version is the difference is less than there might be in some other occasions. But I think as a matter of principle, that sort of change could happen. And in fact, we know that one of the people whom he attacks violently in this speech, a man by the name of Vatinius, he subsequently became reconciled with and in fact defended in court, albeit at the urging of Pompey and Caesar a few years further on. So times change. Well, thank you very much again.